Welcome to the module on Court Interpreter Protocol. This is a simple, very important presentation, so please pay attention. As an interpreter, when you're in court, you are to always interpret in the first person. The interpreter's utterance is the voice of the speaker. Therefore, the interpreter's delivery shall always be done in the first person. If the person says, "I didn't kill my husband," you shouldn't say, "She says he didn't kill." You should say, "I didn't kill my husband," in the other language. Always keep it in the first person. You're the interpreter. You're the voice for either the LEP or the English speakers speaking to the LEP. Did he really say that? Could this happen in court, that a guy starts swearing? Absolutely. I've had occasions to hear witnesses on the witness stand say really bad words in Spanish, and then what do I have to do? I have to interpret that with the best equivalent in English I could come up with. And I've heard a couple of times people swearing in court in English while they're testifying, and if I'm interpreting simultaneously, then I have to interpret those words into Spanish, in my case, with profanity. Remember, you're not the author of the profanity, you're the interpreter. What if the witness keeps switching codes on you? Says parts in English and parts in the other language. Answers sometimes before you even finish interpreting the question. What should you do? Well, there's two parts to this. If he does it or she does it once or twice, you just keep the answer in English. For instance, the question is, do you understand what's going on? You interpret that, and the witness answers in English, "Yes, sir." What should you do? You still say in English, "Yes, sir." Why? Because remember, you are on the record. What you say in English becomes the record. The court reporter is going to be focusing on the voice of the interpreter to understand and to be ready to put that on the record. Therefore, if the person uses a couple of words in English, you say it in English. But if it becomes a problem, if it's constantly happening, if the person interrupts you and starts answering questions before you interpret, what should you do? Well, then you feel that you have something to say, don't you? You really have something to say. Well, if you really have something to say, you have to learn first what I call the interpreter's 4 magic words. "Excuse me, Your Honor." That's right. Anytime you have something to say and you're on the record, before you say anything else, you will stand up, raise your hand, and say, "Excuse me, Your Honor." Once the judge looks at you and gives you the floor, then you're going to do something else, what we call the Elmo rule. You switch and start speaking in the third person. In other words, you say, "The interpreter," and then you state whatever you have to say. In the case of the person constantly switching codes, which is what prompted this change, you would say, "Excuse me, Your Honor," the 4 magic words, and then you would say, "The interpreter would request Your Honor to instruct the witness to answer only in Spanish or in Japanese," whatever language you are interpreting from, because it's confusing the interpreter. That's it. You inform the court, you ask the court, most likely the judge will give an instruction to the person. "Sir, madam, answer only in your language of expertise, wait for the interpreter to finish the question." That's it. That's all you have to do. So there are many occasions when you, the interpreter, are going to feel that you have something to say. If you're on the record, you should always state first the 4 magic words, and then something like the interpreter would like to state blah, blah, blah for the record. Let's assume that you got challenged and somebody states that you interpreted incorrectly or that you did something wrong and you're on the record. First rules first. You don't answer to anybody in the court of law except the judge. So if somebody challenges your interpretation, let's say one of the jurors or one of the attorneys or a person from the gallery or even the person you're interpreting for, you don't answer. You wait for the judge to address you. And the judge will address you and say something like this: what about it, Mr. Interpreter? What about it, Madam Interpreter? The judge might not address you at all. They might decide to tell people, sit down, you're not the expert. My interpreter is my expert. So you cannot answer or engage anybody in conversation until the judge speaks. If the judge addresses you about a mistake that potentially was made by the interpreter, you must answer in one of two ways. Number one, if you believe that you are correct, you would simply say, Your Honor, the interpreter stands by her interpretation, and leave it at that. No need to explain why, no need to pull the dictionary, no need to go to the website. Just just state the interpreter stands by her interpretation. Now, if the judge asks for more explanation, for a source or something, then again you answer to the judge. Remember, you're a court interpreter. You work for the court. Now, in the rare occasion that you might be wrong, then what should you say? You should say, the interpreter stands corrected, and immediately correct the record. For instance, if you made a mistake on a date, you would say, when the interpreter said November, she should have said October. That's it. You correct the record, you move on. But what if you're not on the record? Court is not in session, or you're at a deposition, and you're not on the record yet. Then, of course, you don't need to switch third person, first person, unless you are on the record. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't follow the Code of Ethics. And the Code of Ethics specifically says, interpreters shall behave professionally. So if you are acting as an interpreter, if you are working as an interpreter in any capacity, wherever you are, you always should behave professionally according to the Code of Ethics. Therefore, your interactions with court personnel and parties should be always respectful. You should dress appropriately, and you should also address everybody appropriately by their last name, Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so. It's all about the code. You have to stand by the Code of Ethics. And if your language is one of those languages when there is the formal and the informal way of addressing people, always use the formal way to address people. Except if you're talking to children, and I mean little children, not somebody that is a minor technically, but they're 17 years old. I'm talking about children. Other than that, you should always use the formal, because think about it. Even if English doesn't have a formal way to address people, the difference that we would have in French like vous and tu, or Spanish usted and tú, it's always you. The judge and attorneys always address each other very formally. Even if the defendant has been found guilty of a horrible crime, the judge will still say something like, Mr. Smith, you have been found guilty of whatever. They're not going to just change because the person is now a convicted felon. And this is the last part of this module. Please continue to study your Code of Ethics and make sure that you come back and rehear this anytime you feel necessary. Thank you. We'll see you on the next module.